Dragon's Dogma is one of those games that's been on my radar to play for nearly a decade at this point, and in my Steam library for half that time. I will get around to playing it at some point, I told myself, and actually tried a couple of years ago, but for some reason bounced off it. That's not always the fault of the game. Maybe the latest release distracts you, or the nagging reality of things that aren't games that need attending to. I'd heard great things though: excellent combat akin to something like Platinum Games' fast action combat that felt satisfying. I'm beating around the bush here because what I was playing at the time was Skyrim, and in that game the combat really sucked, so I was kind of drawn to Dragon's Dogma in that it seemed very similar, but better combat. In fact, I'm pretty sure playing Skyrim so avidly was the reason I didn't try Dragon's Dogma. I really got into modding that game, adding AI to make the companions better, trying multiple mod combinations to enhance the lackluster fighting and magic, and the Skyrim I ended up playing was very different from the vanilla game after all that tinkering. Upon getting into Dragon's Dogma this time, I was struck by just how much this game resembles that modded, enhanced version of Skyrim I ended up creating for myself. Primarily companion mods. I added a lot of enhancements that turned it from a game where you're the all-powerful Dragonborn into a game where you're one of a party of adventurers. And that's one of the core things that makes Dragon's Dogma unique, are its pawns. This is what the game calls your AI companions. Immediately, this is different to most over-the-shoulder third-person action RPGs. Somehow Dragon's Dogma is a party management game, in addition to featuring that kind of hack-and-slash gameplay. The two things are generally separate, or when it's attempted, doesn't work very well, making twitchy combat decisions on the fly while also giving orders to party members. It's usually a massive pain, and the primary reason most party-based RPGs end up turn-based or feature a much more methodical combat system. The reason Dragon's Dogma is able to pull this off very effectively, in my opinion, is that your pawns are really quite intelligent, especially for a game that came out so long ago. You don't have to micromanage them much at all. In fact, there are only 3 orders you can give them: attack, come back to me, or help me. Everything else is taken care of when you choose their personality and inclinations, either at character creation or later in the game through dialogue or items you give them.
Understood. Aiding my fellow pawns will be my first priority.
They also gain knowledge as you encounter certain enemies and fulfill quests, so the pawns you recruit from other players, they can offer handy tips about enemy weak points, suggest ways to progress in a quest, point out features in the environment you might have missed, because they've done that with their player, the player they belong to.
Proceed with caution, Master. There may be wolves about.
Wait for an opening. They attack in quick succession.
They're left exposed after a grand fight.
I will go into more detail later about how you actually acquire those pawns from other players, because I'm sure it sounds confusing if you haven't actually played the game, but just trying to give a broad overview at this early stage. It's a far cry from being in a party of actual humans, but about as close to replicating that in a game as I've played, even when the party is full of wonderful, colourful characters in an RPG. Those characters generally never change, but your NPCs do genuinely seem to get smarter in Dragon's Dogma. The shock of this working so well led to a major change for me in how I played the game. Knowing I would have NPCs to manage, my first choice was a mage. I thought I'll sit at the back of a battle, healing and buffing what I expected to be some pretty idiotic party members controlled by the computer. Turns out this wasn't required at all. Your pawns attack where appropriate, and there isn't really a downside to them getting incapped very much. You simply run towards them and revive them, something you can do as the Arisen whatever class you happen to choose. So I thought, screw it, let's do the ultimate test, turn my main pawn into the healer and see if he can intelligently respond to problems while I go mental and just enjoy the combat. And it totally worked. I was amazed. I didn't have to worry about him healing when I needed healing or removing debuffs from myself or other party members. He knew when to do that and did it instinctively. It's funny how the experience of a game can shift you in unexpected directions. Being freed in this way to choose a different class highlighted the fact that I was able to do that. You can switch at any time. I didn't have to restart. What's more, some of the skills you learn from those various classes, they carry over. So as a warrior, for instance, you get several skills to buff your survivability, so you could choose to level up that class, grab the desired passive skill, then switch to another class, yet you still receive that passive benefit. I did this specifically to get the sinew ability, which buffs the amount of stuff you can carry before becoming encumbered. One quirky decision among the many of Dragon's Dogma is to tie carry weight not to class or your strength statistic, but to the physical look of a character. So small, slender characters can't carry very much. It makes perfect sense. I can see why most games don't do this, since tying customization to a game mechanic in this way, it can hamper the range of choices that players have on character creation. But in this case, for this quirky game, it just seems to make sense and is another nod towards realism that I really appreciated. It's the reason I have a huge oversized mage as my main pawn now, for instance. He started out as a warrior where the big bulky silhouette made sense, but the fact I later wanted him to act as a mage doesn't affect his ability to still act as a pack mule for me because he's still huge. I also now have this really quirky wizard character who's massively oversized. Who says the wizarding fraternity needs to consist of these scrawny Harry Potter clones? In these reviews, I sometimes drill down into the minutiae too early though, the stuff that makes a game different and unique for me without properly covering the basics. It's usually because I'm overexcited and enthusiastic about the game, which is no bad thing. However, I do need to cover more of the fundamentals for people who are considering whether to give Dragon's Dogma a go. So the world, it's very pretty to look at despite the game's age. Very grounded, realistic, almost gritty feel. You have a lot of freedom to travel where you like from the start. A plus for me in this type of game, but there are a lot of invisible walls that funnel you in a given direction. It's this strange mixture of really feeling confined in some ways. They're those cliff sides that you can't crest no matter how hard you try, so there's only really one way you can go, but those areas themselves can be quite expansive. And there are tons of them: coastal areas, hillsides, grasslands, mountains, and all of them take a decent amount of time to traverse. You feel like you're moving across a landscape before you unlock the game's fast travel system, and it's quite a nice one, I think. You have these waystones and port crystals. The crystals can be placed anywhere in the overland that you feel you might like to return to, and so long as you have one of those waystones to hand, you can use it and magically pop back there. The port crystals are also, you can remove them. So you can, once you're not going to be visiting that area again, you pick up the port crystal, take it with you, and you're going to plop it down somewhere else. It seems to me that so many things in Dragon's Dogma are familiar adjacent, so to speak, by which I mean fast travel is obviously something we'll expect and arguably will need in a game of this scale, but it does it in this slightly unexpected way. Most of the time this works to the game's advantage, but not always. The game requires you to highlight the current quest you're interested in, for instance, at which point red question marks will appear above relevant characters' heads, or markers will appear on the map, but only for that given quest, the quest that you're tracking. This can lead to you running past NPCs that might be important for another quest without even realizing it. You kind of miss things, or having to switch between quests and recheck the map to see which location is closest before you set off. It's a little bit fiddly. I don't know, maybe the developers wanted to avoid that Far Cry effect where your map is just covered in points of interest, a confusing mess of things. Or another nod, I suspect this is it really, it's a nod towards realism, because they are interested in creating an authentic world with this game. But it doesn't really work in my opinion. I think there could be better ways to do that and still retain some, make things easier for the player to track those quests. Speaking of menus, the game was originally released on console, then later ported to PC, and you definitely feel that. I can't not mention that. Sometimes left clicking with the mouse doesn't work and you're best navigating the menus with your keyboard. It's a minor gripe specific to the PC port, but I always feel a bit like a second-class citizen when the inventory and menus in a console port really don't go the whole hog for PC. Thankfully, this jankiness doesn't apply to the combat and moment-to-moment gameplay, which works extremely well. I never felt hamstrung at all by weird button combinations or bindings that were in awkward places, being able to control my character really well, if not better than I would have been able to with a controller. Mouse and keyboard will always be first for me, so long as the controls are laid out logically, which they are here when it comes to your character, but in terms of inventory management, it's just a pain from start to finish. The idea you can withdraw or deposit items into your storage from the same screen, that would seem logical. In Dragon's Dogma, that's not the case. The act of putting things away or taking them out need to be separate operations with separate menus. Similarly, if you combine items together, you have a menu for combinations, and there are many of those in the game. Once you've combined two items together, you can't immediately see that. You have to come out of the combine menu and go back into your main menu to see what you've created. It's clunky at best, just infuriating at worst, and if it weren't for the fact that crafting is largely pointless in this game, since you can pretty much account for everything the enemy is going to throw at you with the right combination of characters and their baked-in skills, it might have annoyed me more. There are some nice surprises in the midst of all the jank, like when I stumbled across how to make these skeleton keys for opening doors in dungeons. But these are few and far between with the crafting. My advice would be not to spend too much time in those menus and with crafting overall. Just hoard everything, since gear enhancements are tied to items that you find in the world, so just keep hold of everything. Mercifully, shopkeepers do pull from your storage, so once it's in your storage, just dump everything in there, and when you want to enhance with a shopkeeper, they will know you've got it in your storage. So not all bad, I guess. I do wonder sometimes though why video games struggle so much with inventory management, particularly RPGs, where half the game is about finding rare treasure, hoarding things, then moving those things between your characters and your vault. Skyrim's inventory, it was pants without mods, and even Golden Boys like the recent Baldur's Gate 3 whiffed in terms of inventory management, I feel. It must be more complex, much more complex than I realise, and you know. Move a thing from A to B, how hard can that be? Well, it must be hard because so many get it wrong. Anyway, I'm digressing or straying away from the path to point out a weed, which is sometimes important if the weed is a bastard that could poison you and ruin your day. What you're really wondering is, what kind of fantasy world is this? Well, it's medieval Europe in terms of geography, architecture and climate. All the characters speak with this yoldy English accent that we as modern audiences interpret as authentic, even though nothing could be further from the truth. But what makes the game distinct is the fact that the developers are Japanese. So it's this Western high fantasy setting filtered through a very Eastern sensibility. The way this contributes to the game's feel is very difficult to articulate. If you've played any games like this, Western setting Japanese developers, you'll kind of already have a feel for what I'm driving at. But things just feel slightly off, majority of the time not in a bad way, just in a quirky way. Things just feel surreal. Something about the way the NPCs speak, coupled with the random things they have you doing, it feels more Final Fantasy or Yakuza than the grimdark approach to RPGs Western developers often take. Then again, maybe that's changing since Baldur's Gate 3 was pretty nuts in places too, but Dragon's Dogma feels goofy. It's little things, like the way the characters speak, the overuse of this word ought. Come here, Arisen, I've got aught to give you, or there's aught we can do about this.
Crates may hold aught of use.
Now this might not be the original devs, it could be purely the localization and the translation teams, but I've never heard this word used in so many contexts in this game before. Not growing up as a native English speaker or studying English literature at university where we looked at Middle English and Old English texts. In Dragon's Dogma, it's like this seasoning that they sprinkle into sentences in order to make it sound period specific. I should say it doesn't annoy me, it just adds to that sense of weirdness. Are these NPCs real, or are they just actors in this big budget Renaissance fair that's going on around me? I already mentioned that the regions are big and take time to traverse, but you also have a lot of freedom. You can mantle onto ledges, run across rooftops, and explore in a way I wouldn't expect in most Western RPGs. This is linked in my mind to that Japanese sensibility too, in that it puts an emphasis on the game the word game in video game. There are these collect quests where you're required to find your way to difficult locations. Straying off the beaten path usually results in a treasure chest or some other collectible, or even NPCs with side quests to offer. It's all much more intricate than I at first thought when I jumped in for that brief period a few years ago. Give this game a few hours and the slightly dated graphics, which serve to highlight the extent of the world to the modern eye, they fall away and the game, it really comes to life and engages you. You start to notice all the nooks and crannies and the bits of the environment that you thought were simply set dressing or inconsequential. It turns out many of those have a purpose. There was this region of the main city I thought was home to some vagabond NPCs, just a collection of characters put there for flavour and atmosphere. Imagine my surprise when I turned up there later, coming from a completely different direction, having stumbled through a dungeon, and they were overjoyed to see me and the NPC I was escorting with me. The age of this game and the weirdly quirky dialogue and characters could lead you to underestimate it. I did initially, but please don't, because you will be missing a treat. I haven't talked about half the things I want to yet, so settle in. I can tell when a game has really impressed me because the scripts for these videos go ridiculous. Oh, this is over 2,500 words at this point, and I haven't even mentioned character creation in depth yet. So let's do that now. Holy hell. Another example of the game seeming simplistic on the surface, but it's incredibly deep underneath. The advanced options for character creation are actually easy to miss, so pay close attention. But you have a multitude of options for body type, faces, hairstyles. You can create pseudo giants with rippling muscles, tall, slender, elven types, a diminutive pixie style character that only comes up to the average person's knee. There are no races as such. Everyone is technically human, I think, in this first game, but there's a huge range of options to create what you might consider to be, I think in D&D they're called demi-humans, like kind of elves and dwarves, but you can create those kind of characters with the character creator. They're just not, you're not selecting race dwarf, but you have all the options to make a dwarf if you wish. My first character, for instance, he was squat, had a beard, belly, he came up to the elbow of his lady friend who was human. He was a dwarf. Later in the game you can find items that's changed the skin colour even, and the hair colour to more exotic hues, so it's totally possible to create all kinds of fantastical fantasy races, and I can only think this was a conscious choice to not pin you down to one particular race of beings in character creation. You can do what you like. Just as the class system is malleable and allows you to pick and choose, character creation does the same thing, gives you a range of options and says go nuts. It's an approach tailor-made for a player like me who doesn't want to be pinned down from the start and wants the opportunity to truly create a character they connect with. But there's no bloody voiced protagonist, which I'm really happy about. Hate that. Your character never utters a word, thank God. Who are they? Who are you? More accurately, you're the Arisen, a special being who is magically imbued with the power to command a legion of otherworldly warriors known as pawns. They exist in a sort of limbo, eternally waiting for an Arisen to rise and lead them to victory. This has happened again and again throughout history, and this repeated cycle is a core element of the story. I will try to avoid spoilers here, but some of it I think rises from that, again, that game first approach to design, in that I think some of the story beats in Dragon's Dogma are to do with the choice of things that mechanically make the game unique, primarily the pawns. As soon as you add those pawns, you have to explain who they are, how this is happening, where they come from, and that becomes a larger part of the story than it would seem at the start. To go into a little bit more detail about those pawns, you start the game by creating your own character and your main pawn. Then after that you visit the plane of these pawns and choose the remaining 2 party members from other players. The pawns they've created to be their mains become your supplementary members. There are rewards for having your pawn chosen by others as well, but really it's just this unique mechanic that lends a dyed-in-the-wool single-player RPG, which this game is, still has that sense of community without the need to accommodate or talk to real people. Perfect for me because, honestly, after playing MMOs for years, sometimes you just want a break from people. It's always 50-50 whether they'll be a blessing or a curse. In Dragon's Dogma, you get a sense of those other players. You can see their choice of pawn and deduce their character and thrust through the game from that, but there's no obligation to actually do anything for them or with them. Absolute bliss. Another knock-on benefit of this system is that besides your main pawn, these additional pawns don't level up with you, so once the spread gets too wide, you're again returning to the Rift to recruit new party members, level appropriate companions. It's an opportunity to see how a different character class plays sometimes, and might even lead you to change your party composition entirely, or your main pawn's class, or even your class. It's a game that encourages experimentation. Technically, this might not be the optimal way to play, since you level up different stats according to your class. So if you're playing as a warrior throughout, you will get much more strength and survivability if you never switch to a mage. But being a hybrid certainly didn't affect my ability to complete the game, and enhanced my enjoyment immensely, since whenever I got bored or fancied a change, I could switch. It's a lot like the job system in Final Fantasy Tactics, one of my favourite games of all time. I played that game to unlock jobs, mix and match classes, and come up with interesting combinations. I've always liked to do that in games. I appreciated the freedom Dragon's Dogma offers immensely. No need to go back to the beginning, suffer through the tutorial again, race through all those low-level quests to get back to where you were when you choose a new class. You can do it at any time. It was such a breath of fresh air, and the game never foregrounds the option. It's just like you stumble across your ability to do this as the extent of the world starts and the scope of the game starts to unfold to you. It doesn't seem that way. I think it's to do with the age of the game. It doesn't seem like it would be this expansive and offer this many options, but it really does. I keep getting that word in my head, sandbox. It feels like a sandbox. It's not quite the right description for Dragon's Dogma because it's very narrative focused. It's a story driven game. It's not Minecraft where you can reshape the world and come up with your own objectives, but in terms of character and skill choices, I'm struggling to think of another RPG that really offers you this much freedom. The 3 default character classes are very different in the way they play, so you've got plenty of options there. They're the holy trinity, basically, familiar to MMO players from the dawn of time, with the fighter generally serving as the tank, the strider is DPS, and the mage healing or casting ranged damage spells. But the way you play feels very reactive and fun regardless. Even as the mage, you're moving around, finding the best place to be so you're not ganked by enemies and targeting your spells in different ways. You can drop a heal at a fixed point or track your fighter as he runs around and trigger it just as he's fighting, so he's regenerating at the same time. And the spread of secondary abilities you receive further enhances that sense of uniqueness. The strider gets a dodge, the warrior a parry to turn blows, and the mage has one of the most enjoyable and useful traversal exploration abilities in that he can float, particularly good for tricky situations where a treasure chest is just out of reach, or for finding those unique items that have been squirreled away by the devs. Once you're familiar with your class, you can choose to specialize. 3 more options open up, consisting of the warrior, ranger, and sorcerer. Although these are referred to as advanced vocations, they're not really that. They don't replace the base classes. They're more like variations on a theme. The warrior is focused more on attack. He drops the shield in favour of a broadsword. The sorcerer loses healing in favour of bigger fireballs. And then there are hybrid options, the Mystic Knight, Assassin and Magic Archer, which add further nuance. Honestly, I really loved the class I ended up with, the Magic Archer, primarily because I arrived at it through that experimentation process, trying things out until I found the right fit. I really love it when your character evolves over time in this way and changes according to their experience. I'm not just talking about XP bars either. I mean the actual moment-to-moment experience of living in that world and evolving according to those experiences. So my guy started as a mage in my head, having been a bookish sort, sequestered away from real life, focusing on his studies, but once he was out in the world, faced with dire wolves and goblins trying to tear his face off, he chose to channel that magical education into his bow that fired magical arrows. Perfect! 100% bought in at that point. When a game allows me the freedom to create a unique character that I really connect with, my brain sort of switches into a different mode. I realize this isn't just going to be another game. This is going to be an experience that sticks with me. I'm going to remember this character, and it will join that exclusive group that have become for me as important as the named characters in a known intellectual property. So my Hunter in Skyrim or my Jedi in Star Wars Galaxies. No one else cares about those characters, but to me they loom large in my mind. They're as important as Luke Skywalker or Geralt. From my adventures, so my Magic Archer will definitely be joining those guys. I haven't spoken much about the combat yet, which is weird because it's a big part of why people enjoy Dragon's Dogma and why they remember it so fondly. The most obvious aspects are these large monstrous creatures, trolls, chimeras, dragons you encounter, and your ability to climb all over them, clinging on for dear life as they flail about, trying to desperately stab them in some vital organ. And I agree, it's a brilliant aspect of the game and something very few games allow. Only a handful spring to mind, with Shadow of the Colossus being the most obvious. He's visually impressive and looks good in marketing materials, so that's why you see so much of that. But it's only really one aspect of a much more broadly enjoyable and comprehensive combat system. It's not always the best thing to do, clamber over a giant, to be honest, since you lose stamina as you try to cling on. Half the time you're just draining stamina as you try not to get thrown off the thing's back. So sometimes it's best to target vulnerable spots from range or choose a magical spell that the enemy is vulnerable to in order to create openings instead. Again, it's the range of choices that make it interesting, along with other opportunities for interactivity between your party. Enemies can be stunned, for instance, which allows you to grab them and hold them in place for one of your pawns to run them through, or vice versa. You can really dig into this aspect, choosing party skills like the Warrior's Shield Vault, which allows you to throw your companion up in the air. Good for attacking aerial combatants or landing on the back of a dragon. But honestly, I found myself going for more basic attacks the majority of the time, using my solo combos, supporting my pawns with arrows as they ran around pulling off these fancy interactions. I don't want to overlook areas where my opinion doesn't quite gel with the received wisdom about a game. And if I'm honest, I found a lot of these skills, the quirky interactive ones, fun, but they can be a pain to pull off, and occasionally they can get you into trouble if you're focusing on making them work rather than fighting in combat. The range of skills is vast, and unlocking new combat abilities was one of the main driving forces for me leveling. There are a few occasions where you simply get a more powerful version of a given ability, but majority of the time you're unlocking things that are new and interesting with each level. And it's worth trying everything out because the utility of those skills, it's not really 100, it's not obvious until you start to play around with them. It's kind of the opposite of boring stat boosts, really. One of my favourite skills for the Magic Archer, for instance, was one that I didn't think I'd want at all when I first unlocked it. A magical flare arrow that would stun guys and damage undead. Big deal. I won't be fighting undead half the time, and that's a slot I'd rather have free for my ability that allows me to fire 10 arrows at once. Except the stun, when I used it, was really good. It gives you time to think, creates openings for your pawns to use those special abilities, but most important of all, the flare lit up my surroundings. The nighttime in Dragon's Dogma is really dark, so are some of the dungeons, and although you have a lantern and torches, they can sputter out, and the circle of light they create doesn't extend very far. Again, realism. Ordinarily I'd crank up the gamma, but I really didn't want to lose that sense of immersion. Instead I fired off these flare arrows down a gloomy corridor or lit the eaves of a forest at night. It really became one of my favourite things to do. It felt like I was playing a game of pen and paper D&D, where your skills and equipment aren't all about killing enemies, they have a utility outside of combat. So yeah, combat is really good. It reminds me of something like Demon's Souls, but not as punishing. There are a few situations you can't tackle with only a few difficulty spikes where you need to rethink, or might need to rethink, your overall strategy. It's not easy, but fun seems to be the priority rather than player skill. There are opportunities to get really good with all the counters and combo attacks, and knowledge of what works best against what foe will contribute massively to your effectiveness, but it's not strictly necessary in Dragon's Dogma, I don't think. I think you could get through it button mashing if you so choose. Just make sure you have a mage nearby throwing out heals. The quests and overarching narrative are what you might expect for a high fantasy RPG, breaking down into two main types, combat and non-combat quests, with the non-combat generally consisting of dialogue with NPCs. You have to find evidence to convict a guy, you have to side with a landlord who's trying to, or the tenants he's trying to evict, and so on, and trying to negotiate a peace. That type of thing. It's a nice break from the combat. It's not particularly deep, those quests, but yeah, they're a nice break from the go here, fight things style quests that generally make up the majority of things you'll be doing. I did find though that those quests, the combat oriented quests, don't take as long as I would expect from this type of game, which is a relief given the glacial pace of something like Pillars of Eternity, or the intricate web of relationships which takes hours to play out in Baldur's Gate 3, or the juggernaut that is Skyrim. I've mentioned that's a favourite of mine, but it does start to get old when you arrive at yet another Draugr cairn and you realise you're going to need to set aside an hour or an hour and a half, because the dungeon is going to take that long to thread your way through. Dungeons in Dragon's Dogma are varied and interesting, but they don't take an age to wind your way through. Half an hour, maybe, on average. And there were several occasions when I arrived at a notable location to discover it was not an area that would take an age to tackle, serving more as a backdrop for a key encounter or story beat. That was a relief sometimes, because you do these dungeon crawls in such games can be a slog. With regard to the overarching story, it put me in mind of Dark Souls, weirdly, or a Souls-like game, in that it's all about the world, what is going on in the world and what is your place in it. In Dark Souls, that comes through context clues and scraps of information that you find in the world. It's less esoteric in Dragon's Dogma. You learn about the world through dialogue with characters and quests, but it is still mysterious, and you don't understand at the start what the pawns are, what the Arisen is, who you are, and it gradually unfolds and you piece it all together, if that's making sense. At first it seemed to me, though, that the familiar fantasy trope of a world-ending threat, that was what the game was all about. In this case, a dragon threatening the land, and you have to defeat the dragon. And actually, for the majority of the game, I forgot about these other breadcrumbs that were being sprinkled throughout, like the pawns, the Arisen, what's going on there. I'm trying to avoid spoilers, but there are multiple endings in the game, and towards the conclusion of the main narrative, there was this dawning realization for me that the dragon was almost a giant red herring. There was something deeper and more interesting going on, and I'll just say that your reward for defeating the dragon, my reward for defeating the dragon, was not at all what I would expect, and I loved it. I really want to talk more about this, but given the fact that there are multiple endings, your experience will vary. You might make different choices, so it's hard to do that. What I will say is that the story I experienced was one that defied convention. It was one of those moments where you think, well, that's it, right? That's the end of the story. It's over. But then there's this whole extra, even more important bit that unfolds after what you think would be the conclusion. Star Wars does this. You get this feeling after they've rescued Princess Leia that could be emotionally the end of the movie. You're elated, you feel relieved, the characters are celebrating, they've escaped. That's until you remember that the Death Star is still a threat. Darth Vader is still coming after them. They've got the plans, but what the hell do they do with them? And then there's this massive topper at the end with the attack on the Death Star. It accelerates to this even greater climax. That was the end of Dragon's Dogma that I experienced. It was just much darker in tone, and it left me feeling like this game was very unique in its storytelling. Yeah, really, really effective. So should you play this game? Is it worth playing, particularly before the sequel comes out? Yes, yes, and yes. But not because you need to play it in order to understand the next chapter. I think that will be thoroughly approachable without knowledge of this first game. But if you're like me, someone interested in playing unique games for their own sake, you will be missing out on something by skipping over the first Dragon's Dogma. This is the sort of experience I was hoping for when I decided to include older games in with my reviews on the Napyet channel. The best gaming experiences don't always come from playing the latest greatest thing, the new flavour of the month. In fact, the games I've enjoyed the most over the years are the ones that snuck up on me or I may have missed. They can be decades old or fairly obscure, but this just makes them all the sweeter when you discover them. You feel like you've discovered this hidden gem that only you and a few other discerning players know about. And it's for this reason primarily you should do yourself a favour and give Dragon's Dogma a go. Thank you for watching as always. To my loyal channel subscribers in particular, thank you for continuing to support, and at this point we are over 10,000 subscribers in this decades-long YouTube experiment. I'm immensely grateful to you all for sticking around. The channel has morphed and switched focus several times, but people have continued to watch as I waffle on about games. That's been the thread all the way through. In whatever style, whatever game it may be, it's me talking about games. Moving forward into 2024, I'm hoping I'm going to be able to do more videos. Since the past few months they've been difficult, living in limbo. We've been moving house basically, so everything's been up in the air. Soon I'll be able to dedicate a space again to record videos, and hopefully that will increase the output on the channel. I hope you'll stick around for that. Thank you once again for the support. I've been Napyet, and should you play Dragon's Dogma, yeah, play it and let me know what you think. Alright, bye for now.